What role do either of you feel like dominance should play in training a dog? I guess we'll start with you.
Well, I would say zero part. I mean, I don't think dominance is an important part of the dog-human relationship at all.
Library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to our esteemed guests. I am so delighted to be able to chat with you, Clive and Alex. I think I want to start by asking a question that I know is, well, first I want to find out, show of hands, how many dog owners are there in the audience? That's what I thought. And so I think I'm going to ask a question that's on everybody's minds, and that matters to most of us, which is that our dogs are very excited to see us when we get home. I know all of your dogs will be quite excited when you get home. We would love to believe that our dogs love us. Do our dogs actually love us, and how do we know? So I'll start with you, Clive.
Sure. Well, I think you're entitled to believe the evidence of your senses. I think that the way that your dog greets you, the full body, the full energy, I think at the most basic level, we're just entitled to trust the evidence of our senses. I mean, when I come home, my wife grunts and my son says nothing, but my dog, you hear her claws on the wooden floor racing to get to me from wherever she's been, because this is crucial to her.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and Alex, I guess you would
Yeah,
echo
I'm
that,
not going to contest that, right? Absolutely. Dogs form attachments to us really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
After just seeing somebody a few times in a shelter, dogs start to form attachment-like behaviors at recognizing us, certainly. There's been really nice research about greeting behavior, that dogs, we think, dogs just are excited whenever we come home, right? Even if you've just gone to the basement for a minute. But there's been this lovely research by Therese Wren and her colleagues that the enthusiasm of that greeting is even greater every couple of hours. They actually measured things like tail wag intensity over time. And
that's a measurable unit.
Absolutely, in our
intensity.
Field it is. Yes,
that's amazing.
Yeah. So it just gets greater the longer we've been gone, and that's a sign of their love for us.
That's amazing. Well, I guess that's it, folks. Thanks so much for
Done.
So, I mean, Clive, I know that you are amongst your colleagues. Taking emotions too seriously can become dangerous, or amongst behaviorists certainly. They're wary of looking at emotion when interpreting the behavior of dogs as an indicator of their internal states, right? To guess how they feel. But I don't know if you started there or if you are there. Go ahead.
Well, so I would call myself an emotional behaviorist. So it is true that historically behaviorists were skeptical about emotion as a driver of behavior, as a cause of behavior. But I actually think that you can use behavior to deduce the emotions that animals or people are experiencing. Right. I mean, it's not the only line of evidence. We have multiple lines of evidence that our dogs have emotional lives, neuroscience, physiology, and so on. But I think that you can see in a dog's behavior, you can see the emotions. You can see when a dog is frightened. A terrified dog is a very different dog from a happy dog. So I would call myself, an emotional behaviorist.
Okay, and was that where you started, and you have always been, or is that you started somewhere more strict behaviorist?
I started back in the dark ages. I was a more mainstream behaviorist,
right.
But I think the weight of evidence forced me to recognize that if our dogs are anything, they are emotional beings.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I'm excited to dive into some of the backstories there. For you, you've talked about some of the things, the misconceptions that we have about what our dogs are thinking, what's actually happening in their heads. Behaviorists are sometimes nervous about overinterpreting because sometimes we do genuinely get it wrong. One of those instances, I think, is when we've all had this experience when your dog does something maybe you aren't thrilled about. You love your dog, but you're not thrilled about it. And your dog has that expression. You all know it when they make their guilty face.
The guilty
right?
look.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Should we be interpreting that as an indicator that they actually feel guilty about the things they've done?
Right. I think we have to be hesitant, right? Of course, I'm a great believer that dogs and other non-humans have emotions. There's all sorts of evidence. But we are kind of hasty to put on more complicated emotions on non-humans that might, and especially dogs, that might not really be suited to them. And this, in fact, one of the great things about studying dogs, where as soon as a dog comes into your house, we start talking about what they feel and want and know and the grudges they're holding against us, right, and so forth. And my question as a scientist is, like, can that be empirically tested, whether they have that experience? And so I did do a study about the guilty look, which we all recognize, and whether it actually was brought on by having done something about which they should feel guilty, namely stealing a bit of food they've been ordered not to take. And it turned out it was not a response to their misdeed. Instead, it was a response to the person thinking that they'd done something wrong. And it looks like that behavior, which is a real behavior, is more a response to humans and a kind of submissive gesture saying, like, I see you're angry, like, please don't hurt me.
Yeah.
And it's
And
very
of course
effective.
we never would.
It's
So-
very cute.
Yeah, so they feel more, I guess, anxiety about how we might react, and but we're going to continue to imagine that they feel guilty, though. I think it's
No,
very, it's very cute.
I wear both hats, right? Somebody who lives with dogs and somebody who studies dogs, and I definitely see my dog holding like a giant stick, like 6 times his body length,
Yeah.
and think he looks really proud. I say that, but then I also say, okay, well, how could I test that, actually?
Yeah. So I'm so curious. I know about the tail wag index now, and that
Yeah,
is maybe
that's
the
important
happiest.
to know.
The fact that will make me the happiest of any that I've learned in my line of work is that exists. But what are some of the other ways you're measuring what it is that dogs are thinking? If you want to know.
It is all looking at behavior, right? It's looking at, if we're doing a study with dogs, we take them into a relatively controlled setting, like a laboratory, where there's only 2 things they can choose among. And for instance, I'm really interested in what they can smell in the world. So I might present them with 2 different quantities of a smell and see if they care about the difference between those things. So their behavior is always showing to us, and every dog's behavior is showing to us all the time what they know or think or understand. You just have to create a scenario which isolates the thing you're interested in asking about.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got lots of behavioral measures. I know there are also neurochemical measures that we can use to figure out what dogs are thinking. There's one called oxytocin,
Right.
the love hormone. Can you tell us a little bit about?
Sure. So oxytocin, people call it the love hormone. We need to be a little bit careful because hormones are physiology and love is something else, and
Right.
there can never be a direct, perfect connection. But still in all, oxytocin is a hormone that spikes in people's bodies when they're in situations of very intense emotional connection.
Right.
So nursing mothers, newly enamored young couples, not old married couples, but so researchers in Japan decided to set up scenarios where they would bring people and their dogs into their laboratory together and just have them look lovingly into each other's eyes and measure before and afterwards the level of oxytocin in the person's body and in the dog's body. And what they found was that oxytocin spikes in both partners when they look lovingly into each other's eyes.
Wow, so they really
Yeah.
do seem to experience love then. Are there any studies that look at the oxytocin levels of people watching videos of that experiment?
Not to my knowledge, but there's a good idea.
'Cause
Yeah.
I imagine it would probably
Yeah,
show up as well.
They did do a study. They included in the study a condition where they sprayed oxytocin up the nose of the dogs because apparently it can get into your brain through the nose.
Really?
And they found that if you do that to a dog, the dog will look at you more lovingly.
This is overwhelmingly adorable. There's this story that I think that we all know about, or about how dogs came to be such loving companions.
Yeah.
And I think the story most of us has heard is something like, we were in hunter-gatherer societies, and we had lots of scraps of food and things like that lying around, and dogs wolves in particular, they started sort of hanging around the periphery of our camps, and eventually we sort of started selectively breeding them, artificially selecting who was breeding, and that's how we came to the dogs we have today. That story turns out not to be true. Is that
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a matter of ongoing controversy, and Alex and I have not discussed this beforehand, so I don't know whether we're going to agree. But my view is that the first part is correct, that yes, we were hunter-gatherers, and yes, wolves started hanging around our camps, but the second part is not directly true as such. So that,
Okay.
so that our ancestors 15 to 20,000 years ago had no idea, because there was no such thing in the world, had no idea that if you were to breed animals and choose who has babies with whom, that you would end up with a dog. They couldn't have known that. And so I don't think it's at all likely that they did any such thing. What I think happened was that if wolves are trying to steal food from human dumps, who among the wolves can get the most? Well, it's the wolf who threatens the humans the least. The gentlest, quietest wolf is likely to be the most successful at stealing from human trash dumps. And so that created a pressure, a natural selection for certain wolves to become maybe smaller, maybe friendlier, maybe easier for humans to get along with. And in time, over thousands of years, that became the pooch at the bottom of your bed.
That became all of our dogs we love at home.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that would be my view.
Is that a story that jives with you, or does it seem like we might...
I agree with that story. I mean, it's important to say we don't really know. These
Yeah.
are really just theories about how domestication began. But the idea that wolves sort of self-selected, basically, again, non-intentionally, by just maximally exploiting this new niche of us having so much good food that we threw out that then was available for them to eat, they became more scavenger-like, less just hunting carnivores. And through that, and through their being less fearful of us and maybe less fearsome to us, right, became things that could evolve eventually into dogs. But it was only very recently. I mean, we think about the breeds of dog. When we think about those first dogs, we think of like Pug, and we think of Labrador. They didn't exist 15,000 years ago, right? And this very, very highly selective breeding that brings us all the dogs we recognize today really is only over the last couple of hundred years that's happened.
Right. Was there an appreciation at the time that that really selective breeding started, where we were trying to produce Dalmatians or trying to produce shepherd or collies? Was there an appreciation at that time of some of the potential consequences of it? Did people know that, along with getting these really cute breeds, there are some unfortunate downsides that come along with that?
I don't believe there were. The idea was that you pick, in fact, like for instance, the first German Shepherd, the fellow who was von Holmetz, who wanted to breed the first German Shepherd, wanted to segregate what he thought the best example of a dog, which was at the time was just a shepherd dog or shepherd's dog, segregate them from all the other dogs, rangy mutts that were out there. And so he wanted to create more of that dog, who he named Horan, sort of almost clone-like. So they thought it was only positive to create more of those, and he bred Horan with another dog who also had very good qualities, and then all their young were bred with Horan, right, or that other dog. And they thought that's where you get good qualities. We didn't, at the time, realize that there's a lot of other deleterious effects that come along with it when you inbreed, essentially.
Right. So species like pugs are, I think pugs or
Pugs
bulldogs.
are, right. Yeah, they
Bulldogs
have bulldogs also have a very tough time. They have a really large head. They have to be birthed by cesarean and so forth. And that's because in the breed standard, for the people who love this dog, they wanted to make a gigantic head. It says, make the most ginormous head you can.
They do look
and
cute.
You did that, And then we love, it's funny, it's paradoxical, was we really love some of the flat-faced dogs that have the big eyes that also have a lot of medical problems associated with having a really flat face and really big, bulgy eyes,
In your estimation, Clive, is there there's a common conception amongst the public that certain breeds of dog are just unsafe to have, that they are pretty naturally aggressive and they'll attack, and Rottweilers or pit bulls, those kinds of things. In your assessment, is that correct? Is there such a thing as a dangerous breed?
There's no evidence that any one breed is any more dangerous than any other. If you look at bite statistics, the dogs that bite most frequently are actually dogs like retrievers, and that's simply because there are more retrievers than there are other dogs.
Right.
There are dogs that are some people, tragically, want a dog precisely because they view it as an expression of their own aggressiveness. And there are ways you can treat a dog, sadly, criminally, that will turn it into a dangerous beast. But that's not because of the dog's genetic makeup. That's because of the humans. It's the humans' fault for wanting their dog to be that way.
Right.
And historically also, if you look back, the dog that we thought was the aggressive breed, right now it's probably pit bulls, I would say, but it was Rottweilers, it was Dobermans, it was German Shepherds because of what German Shepherds were associated with.
Yeah.
But back in the early 1800s, it was a dog called the Spitz, which looks approximately like a Pomeranian. I don't know if you know what a Pomeranian looks like, but I'm holding one now.
Terrifying.
Right? It's white, fluffy.
Truly frightening dogs. Yeah.
Right. And so there's something very cultural about what we, and not innate to the dog breed that leads us to call them aggressive.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So it seems like there's not a genetic predisposition for it, but there, at least from what I gathered from your book, there is something like a genetic predisposition to the difference between dogs and wolves. And it was, I think the name of the syndrome was William
Buren syndrome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a very rare syndrome in us human beings called Williams-Buren syndrome. It's, I forget now, it's like 1 in 1,000 or even fewer. And it has multiple impacts. It's a genetic syndrome, and it's caused by damage to 23 or 4 genes. And because it's so many genes, it has a lot of different impacts on people. But one of the most remarkable effects of it is that people with Williams-Buren syndrome are exceptionally friendly.
Yep.
Exceptionally friendly. And I did some research together with Bridget von Holt, who's a geneticist at Princeton, where we were able to identify that when you compare, first of all, when you compare dogs and wolves, dogs are more friendly than wolves.
Yeah, I've
wolves
noticed
can
that.
be hand-reared, and they can be really quite friendly, but they're never as friendly as a typical dog. And where we came up with some standardized measures of friendliness, and then we looked at the genetic differences between wolves and dogs, and we were able to identify that 3 of the 24 genes that are involved in Williams syndrome have actually mutated in the journey from wolf to dog, and
Right.
seem to be responsible for at least part of what makes dogs more friendly than wolves.
Amazing. So our dogs are just genetically, it's likely that our dogs are genetically predisposed to be super
Absolutely.
friendly.
And of course, I mean, it's science and it's clever and it involves genes, but it's also sort of obvious. I mean, everybody knows that dogs are really remarkably friendly individuals on average as a species.
Yeah. I think I would have a very different emotional reaction if I saw a dog approaching me versus a wolf. I don't imagine.
Yeah. And
the
that
wolf
would be
is-
fair enough, really.
Oh,
Yeah,
friendly.
yeah,
What a
yeah.
friendly wolf.
Although there are some. There are friendly wolves.
Yeah.
But not so many.
How do you measure, how does somebody comfortably measure the safety of a wolf or the friendliness of a wolf? How
Well,
would you-
right. So it is possible to hand rear wolves.
Right.
It is possible to do that, and it has been done many times, probably hundreds of times. And I work together with an outfit in Indiana called Wolf Park, where they've been hand rearing wolves since 1974. And if you ask the old timers, if you have drinks with the old timers, and you get them to roll up their pant legs, they will show you the scars from when they were first trying to do this.
the wolves being friendly.
The wolves being friendly. But nowadays, they're really very, very good at it. And they can reliably raise wolf pups who will be quite friendly towards people. And so that's what we do. We simply measure the friendliness of wolf pups towards people that they know and towards strangers, always with staff around so that there's no danger. But we never had any scares.
Is this the circle test you were talking
What
about?
I call the circle test. So you just have somebody sit in a chair and you mark a 1 meter radius around the chair. We're in Canada, so I don't need to explain what a meter is, do I? No. And you just measure, you let the wolf come into the enclosure with a person, and you just measure how, out of a 2-minute period, how long does the animal choose to spend inside the circle. And these hand-reared wolves who know these people, they will spend about 30 seconds out of 2 minutes, so about a quarter of the total time inside the circle being petted by the person. But try this with your dog when you get home. Separate yourselves from the dog. Doesn't need to be long, 10 minutes is enough. Then let the dog back into the room and measure what portion of the 2-minute interval does the dog spend inside the circle. And the answer is typically every last second. Every last second of the 2 minutes the dog spends.
Yeah, you're not surprising anybody here.
Yeah, I know.
That's amazing, yeah. I think that's really fascinating. I can imagine, for me, the wolf thing would be more frightening than the dogs. And I grew up, I didn't get to grow up in a household that had a lot of dogs in it. And My dad, it's partly because my dad's a little bit afraid of dogs. I don't know if you have any people in your family who are the same. He's always really concerned that, number one, the dogs know that he's afraid, and number two, that they're going to kind of try to take advantage of that. I don't know if he's going to be watching this. Is he right? If it's not, don't tell him he's right.
Well, I think that dogs are very sensitive readers of our emotions and behavior, right? And I used to talk about them as anthropologists among us because, you have the dog. If you do this test and you're then looking at the dog to see if they're within your 1 meter radius, but most of the rest of the day you're not looking at the dog, but if you turn around, like your dog is in the corner of the room looking at you, right? Studying you like a little anthropologist. And so they become very familiar with our behavior and they know human behavior pretty well from living
that's
among
what my
humans.
dad's afraid of, actually.
And they notice when something is a little bit different. And there's also, there was a recent study that confirmed this kind of idea that we have that dogs smell fear, right? Like dogs are they're creatures of the nose. They are experiencing us through smell as much as through sight. And we give off an odor when we're stressed, basically. It would probably be related to cortisol, and dogs are sensitive to that. But the third part of his concern is probably not what you have to worry about, right? Like they're not thinking, he looks he looks scared and he smells scared, so therefore I'm going to attack him. They just won't interact with him, right? They're less interested in approaching him. They don't then turn into wolves. Yeah. Right. So he's okay.
That's good. That's good. Did you hear that, Dad? He's going to be okay. So a lot of people have probably seen some of these TV shows with dog trainers who have all kinds of tricks and strategies for training and rearing dogs. I'm not going to name any names, but there are certain kinds of whisperers that we might think of. And often there's these collection of ideas that suggest that dominance is a really important part of training and rearing dogs. What role do either of you feel like dominance should play in training a dog? I guess we'll start with you.
Well, I would say zero part. I mean, I don't think dominance is an important part of the dog-human relationship at all. The reason that people talk about dominance as something that defines a dog relationship is because for a while it was thought that wolves, their closest cousins, form dominance hierarchies, and so that we should imagine that dogs also coming into our homes are kind of trying to figure out who's alpha wolf here. Is it going to be me or is it going to be that guy or that gal? And so the idea is you had to kind of play it out with them. But as it turned out, that science that established that wolves live in dominance hierarchy was based on an observation by a researcher named Schenkel by looking at teenage male wolves who were captive in a small enclosure. And sure enough, when you put teenage male wolves in a small enclosure, they establish a little bit of a dominance hierarchy, as you could imagine putting teenage boys, for instance, in a small enclosure. There might be someone who's kind of the lead. I think Lord of the Flies comes to mind, right? Where they will form some kind of hierarchy, right? But when researchers then suddenly have the technology, which was basically GPS, to look at wolf behavior in the wild, like David Meck, researching how wolves lived with each other in the wild, they live in family units. So at some level, the mother and father are the alpha dogs, right? Like they are in charge. Where's the pack going to go? When are we going to hunt? And so forth. Who's going to reproduce? But they're not alphas. They're not dominant any more than I am dominant of my son. I did tell him to stay in the green room, but I'm not the alpha, and he's not trying to overthrow me, right? I'm not dominating him.
Well,
I'm just, as far as I know.
So I didn't think this would come up. The book. Can you say the name of the book he was reading?
I think the name of the book he was reading is called How to Take Over the World.
Yeah.
I think it was
so keep that in mind.
That was a coincidence. That's a total coincidence. So the notion of dominance, while a very sticky and satisfying notion, really doesn't apply to our relationship with dogs at all.
Fair enough. And that resonates with your experience as well?
A
little bit different? Okay.
So I would take a slightly different take. So the first thing to say is I agree 100% that for anybody who wants to train their dog, the notion of dominance is not at all helpful. Not at all helpful. And in fact, the notion of the use of the word dominance, as is done by popular television dog trainers, has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the scientific notion of dominance. The scientific notion of dominance is just the idea that many social animals live in social hierarchies. We live in social hierarchies. You know who your boss is. You know who's in charge when you get home. Human beings live in social hierarchies. Many social animals, not all, but many social... Lions, curiously, do not live in social hierarchies. So fearsomeness and social hierarchy are not the same idea, right? So many animals live in social hierarchies. There's been controversy over the last 50 years over whether wolves live in social hierarchies. There's very little known research from Germany by a woman called Pedersen that showed that if you take a bunch of dogs, they will form more extreme social hierarchies than if you take a bunch of wolves. And in fact, she did one experiment where she mixed wolf pups and dog pups, and these dogs were all poodles. And very quickly, the poodles were dominant over the wolves. Even as the wolves grew bigger and obviously potentially much more dangerous than the poodles, the poodles were in charge. So, okay, I think that dogs do experience social hierarchy. I also think that dogs living in human households, because dominance in the science of behavior in ethology, dominance is defined as control of resources. And so I think our dogs recognize us as dominant over them because we have utter and complete control over every resource that a dog could ever want.
Yeah, okay.
And yet, I don't think that tells us anything about how we should train them. And it has no further consequences. It's just an interesting observation. It absolutely does not mean, I mean, the bizarre idea that you need to keep reminding your dog that you are the dominant alpha individual, that's absurd. That's absurd. If you are the one who opens the kibble bag or the can, if you are the one who clips a leash onto your dog's collar and not the other way round, then it is as clear as it could ever be to your dog that you are the socially dominant individual. You cannot become more dominant by doing this crazy... I love the idea that we have to walk through doors first so that our dogs know that we're in charge. Our dogs know we're in charge. And what they need, but the consequence of that, the consequence I draw from that is exactly the opposite of what the Whisperer and others of his ilk would draw. The consequence of that is that we have an immense responsibility. We have to care for our dogs. They need us to care for them. Without us, especially in this world like Toronto or any other part of the modern world, they wouldn't survive and thrive without our leadership. That's I think, what the correct consequence is to draw from that, not the idea that you have to have dinner before your dog does. Or...
Hear to that. I think I don't think anybody here would disagree with the notion that we should love our dogs. I think that's why we're all here. I, though, personally am curious about who ended up adopting the poodles that dominated wolves.
Well, I don't know. I've never met Pedersen. She doesn't appear to speak English, and she's retired.
Terrifying.
But we should ask her.
Those are some, intense poodles. In your book, I loved, it was kind of like a love story or a love letter to dogs in a lot of ways, just the ways that we look at and think about our dogs. But it was also peppered with a number of really cool just tidbits that I had no idea about. Dogs can smell time on our bodies. Is that more or less?
Oh, the passage of time?
The passage of time. They can tell what time of day it is.
Well, this is a theory. So I'm very interested in dogs' olfactory acuity, like how well they are smelling the world, right? Like if there are any dogs in this room right now, they're not experiencing it exactly as we are with visual things. That's how we define our world. But for them, it's about this, we're full of smell, where other people have been, trails of food, smells of other animals, and so forth. The breeze coming in a window, and so things like that. So I had a theory that in fact they might experience the passage of time through the kind of waning of a smell over time. And in fact, we do know that tracking dogs who are scent tracking through looking for odors on the ground in footsteps are able to distinguish which way somebody has gone by distinguishing the concentration of odor in the first and fifth footstep of somebody who's absent, right? So not only are we releasing our smell through our shoes, which we're constantly sloughing off the smell of ourselves, but the more recent footstep, that fifth footstep, will have a slightly stronger concentration of us than the first one. And that's how, coming upon a set of footsteps, a tracking dog can determine which way the person has gone. So I figured, in fact, it might be that over the course of the day, the smell of us in our homes, if we're absent, is actually kind of diminishing.
Right.
And, air currents move through the room in a day where they sort of rise to the ceiling and then they fall, and also smells get less strong. So if you've made coffee in the morning, you can smell the coffee, and then after a little bit of time, this coffee smell is dissipated, basically fall into the ground. So it could be that they know kind of when you're going to come home because the smell of you has reached that weakness that usually does when you suddenly arrive.
So this was the hypothesis.
This is a hypothesis, right? I haven't tested it, but there has been a show, a science show, that Nova, I think, which in fact did this with a dog who was very reliable at predicting when his person was going to come home. Every day would stand on the edge of the sofa right as the gent walked in the door. And so what they did was they got the fellow right after he'd been at the gym in the middle of the day, and they took his T-shirt off of him, and they brought it home and stuck it next to the dog by the couch. So suddenly the smell of his person was like profound. He was like right there next to him. And they waited to see what happened when the time arrived and the man came home and he didn't alert to the fellow coming in. So he seemed to think that maybe it wasn't time for him to come home yet.
Wow. So they may be able to, you might not need your wristwatch anymore. You
No,
just need,
absolutely. You just have to get a better nose, yeah.
Yeah. Sexing was something that, or desexing was something that came up in both of your books, and how we might think about that or how we might deal with it. So anybody who watched The Price is Right when they were sick at home on a weekday would have heard Bob Barker say, "Spay and neuter your pets."
Right.
And, theoretically the reason for doing that is that we're attempting to reduce the number of dogs that are euthanized in shelters because there's not sufficient resources to care for them. It seems like a really unnecessary, tragic outcome, but maybe it isn't unnecessary. Where would you land around the idea of spaying and neutering pets? Is that something we ought to be doing as a responsible pet owner? Are there alternatives that we can find instead, or where do you sit with that?
I wouldn't take an overall up or down. I think it depends on the context, the cultural context. I mean, looking at North America, I'm afraid I don't know much about Toronto and the Canadian experience, but certainly in the United States, in the southeast of the United States, you still have dog overpopulation, where it would definitely be a good thing, I think, if more people spayed and neutered their pets. But then on the other hand, further northeast in the United States, you actually have something of a shortage of adoptable dogs, and I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to pull back somewhat on pressuring people to spay and neuter their dogs. So I would take it not exactly on a case-by-case basis, but I think on a community-by-community basis. I think it's something for communities to make their minds up.
And I think in your book, I think it was yours, it seemed like there might be some alternatives, things like injections you can give, I'll just...
In fact, there are sterilants, right? But they just haven't become very popular in North America. Most vets learn how to spay and do the surgeries for spay and neuter, and so that's become ubiquitous, right? And as you say, that certainly seemed like an easy way to solve the problem of overpopulation is to reduce the chance that there's this dog who's stray is going to have any more puppies. It hasn't completely eliminated overpopulation, unfortunately, even though it's quite widespread in North America. And there are also cultures where it used to be illegal until recently to spay or neuter, and they don't have any bigger overpopulation problems. They just have different solutions. But so in North America anyway, the vasectomies and so forth, or sterilants haven't become that popular. But I'm interested in the fact that they haven't, right? I think it's the type of thing that we want to keep, as Clive is saying, reconsidering, because also, the hormones that are in the gonads are important for appropriate development. The testosterone, estrogen, they don't just act in the reproductive system, they act in bone and muscle growth. They act even in the brain, right? So to reduce this is why we don't give our young girls hysterectomies, right? Like it will not only cut off their chance of having future babies, but it also changes their rate of development. So it's an interesting thing that we've just accepted it as very common to do to all of these dogs who we treat as family otherwise, right? They have to go through this odd journey, basically because we as a society have failed to control the reproduction.
Right. You mentioned, I think in your book, you mentioned that there are impacts on things like weight loss and weight gain. And
yeah, and there are two researchers at UC Davis Vet School, Ben and Lynette Hart, who did all these interesting research, which are basically correlations, saying like, what are the rates of, for instance, cancers and bone diseases, and things like obesity in dogs who were spayed and neutered, especially at an early age, which is when we mostly spay and neuter our dogs, or later. And in some breeds, especially in some sexes, like golden retrievers, for instance, the rates of certain cancers are much higher in the early spay-neuter. Rates of obesity are definitely higher. You definitely gain weight if you don't have your reproductive gonads. So it's not the case for all breeds and all sexes, so it's just the type of thing that it would be useful to have a more reflective approach as opposed to a kind of one-size-fits-all approach.
And so what I love, a suggestion you make in your book, or some of the research that you described one of your PhD students did, I think it ties right to that idea that there are less tragic alternatives to our strategies at this point. You said that you pointed out that there is a way that we can increase the number of adoptions and decrease the number of dogs euthanized without adding any extra work to people working in dog shelters. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So it's not something I talk about so much, but in fact, most of the research work that my group and I do is dedicated towards dogs living in shelters, because that is the pointy end of the dog-human relationship in developed nations. We have, in the United States, we have 4 million dogs every year entering animal shelters, and there's still hundreds of thousands of them euthanized. And so we've done a lot of work looking at trying to find cost-effective, easy methods to encourage people to adopt, not shop. And interestingly, one of the simplest ways to get people to adopt dogs from the shelter is to remove from their cage cards the wild guesses, because that's what they are, the wild guesses as to what breeds have gone into the mixed breed dogs who make up 95% of the dogs in the shelters. Mm-hmm. So we did a quite large study where we gave DNA tests to 1,000 dogs. You can buy a DNA test that will tell you the breed of your dog's great-grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. And with that reliable information, we compared that to what the staff at 2 large shelters in the United States, what they were guessing were in these dogs. And apart from guessing correctly the purebred dogs, who were only actually about 5% of all the dogs in the shelter, aside from that, they got almost all of the rest of them wrong. So these are completely wild guesses. And meanwhile, when people go looking for a dog, people very often go with a fixed idea about what breed they think they want. And by taking away the misinformation, I think we were forcing people to actually look at the dogs. If you go to a large shelter and you say you want a golden retriever, a shelter of 100 dogs probably only has 2 that it thinks might be golden retrievers. But if you say, we don't know what they are, why don't you just go and have a look and see if anybody speaks to you? Then there's a much greater chance that a visitor will say, yeah, this dog is it's obviously not a golden retriever, but he seems rather nice.
Yeah. I love that. It's so simple, but it's so powerfully effective. I can imagine doing it myself, that I would go in, I think I know what a golden retriever looks like, but do I really? That looks like a golden retriever to me. So,
and the thing is that it's in the abstract, you think it's the breed that matters. But when you're actually meeting dogs, there are all sorts of things they do. Not just their shape and color, but what they do. So many people say that they didn't mean to adopt a dog, but this dog just spoke to them. He just said, I'm your dog, take me home. I wish I could figure out how we would turn that into a scientific study. How do you capture that feeling people have? But obviously it's something about the behavior of the dog. Yeah. And then it's like, did I say we were going to get a golden retriever? This little black dog just said, I'm your dog. That's why we had to bring him home.
It's true. I mean, people's stories about why they adopted a dog are all about a behavior that they did at the shelter, right? Yeah. And I think also naming is a really important thing at shelters, where the dogs are given a name, even if you're going to change the name, because it starts to individuate them, and they're not just a dog at a shelter, but they're Elvis or whoever they are, and that's a person, and we want to add a person to our family, right? And so it helps to begin that process.
That's amazing. So I can see we're almost at time for question and answer. I want to ask you guys one more question each before we head to our audience. I know that both of you love understanding the ways that dogs think and the ways that they interact with our lives, and I know that you both have dogs and you take walks, and that's often where you get your inspiration for the next experiment you might do. So what is the next experiment that you have in mind that you're thinking, oh, I got to do that one?
Well, we're doing a study right now. Can I talk about that? That's sort of cheating. Well, we're doing something right now, which is looking at, it's actually just a natural observation of dogs, where we're trying to figure out the meaning of a behavior. And again, it's a behavior that we might have thought we knew that there was a meaning for, but nobody's really studied it, which is shaking off behavior. So like the wet dog shake, basically, but not when they're wet, the dry dog shake, right? And if you look, if you go home, you look and you'll see your dog shake in certain contexts. And so what we're doing is a very large-scale study of observations of dogs and seeing what contexts in which they're shaking off. And my hypothesis is that it's a sort of transitional behavior. So they're playing. Somebody decides they don't want to play anymore. They shake off, and then off very often.
Really?
The other dog shakes off, right? And then they go to doing something else for a little while. Or they're entering, they're about to go out for a walk. They step outside with you. They shake off, right? And then the walk ensues. So, but we'll see. I mean, the evidence will show us.
So it really is very Taylor Swifty. Then they're trying to shake it off.
They are shaking. I mean, in a way, it's true.
Fascinating.
There's sometimes something stressful, and to try to get themselves into another frame of mind, they're shaking off. So I'm interested in that. And if I had my druthers, I would also be testing whether they are spreading their scent more in when they shake off, which would maybe be used in a social context, right? And you'd see it more often in social context than in solitary context. So
we will stay tuned for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Cutting
Clive,
edge.
do you have anything coming up that we should keep
Well,
an eye out
it's
for?
funny because, as I say, Alexandra and I did not chat about any of this beforehand, but we're not moving in the same territory. But the domain that I'm so excited that we're finally getting started on, everybody sees their dog and knows how their dog feels. How do we know how our dog feels? I mean, particularly think about dogs wagging their tails, right? Dogs wag their tails when they're happy, sometimes when they're angry, but we know that a happy dog wags his tail. How do we know that? We don't have tails, and we don't take parts of our anatomy that we could potentially wag and wag them when we're happy. It's just not a thing we humans do, and yet we read it in our dogs so well. So I want to understand, and we are now starting studies where we're videoing dogs and showing the videos to people and asking people what they see in the dog. I want to understand, how do people read dog emotion? It feels so intuitive, so obvious, so easy, and yet I'm not aware of any scientific studies that have looked at it. So that's where we're going.
Fascinating.